Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 6 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to talk about Sega. Now for some of you, Sega may be a household name, but for me, it wasn't. I didn't have a Sega anything. I played the Genesis, I played all the systems that, Sega released, but I never personally owned one. So this was very much a learning experience for me, a chance for me to learn some of the intricacies of Sega, some of the histories of Sega. So definitely sit back and relax. This is going to be a fun episode. But this episode wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for two very distinctive people, and that is Indy Kebab and Drex. Our first guest speaker is Indy. Indy is a Turkish streamer who pretty much helped me with everything that you see right now. He came in clutch and helped with all the audio, and he also hooked me up with my audio settings. So I had to go back and record a lot of this stuff over because my new mic, which is an AT2035 or whatever the fuck it is, wasn't really doing well for me. And then it turns out I'm an idiot and I don't know how to turn out. I don't know how mixers work. But now I do, thanks to him. But anyway, he is awesome. He is a variety streamer. He does whatever he wants. Definitely check him out. He's a phenomenal friend and an even better speaker. I love his voice. The second guest speaker is Drex. Drex is a very close friend of mine, somebody who has pretty much been by my side in terms of streaming since I started, and he is a retro variety streamer. Sometimes you'll see him playing Apex, sometimes PUBG, sometimes he's going after his Pugsy world record. I don't know if he still has it anymore, but he's awesome. Speaking of which, he will be at Calithon this Friday. Check out the lineup. I don't know exactly what time it is, but he's there. He's there. But that's enough out of me. This episode has taken too goddamn long to make, so let's sit back, relax, and learn a little bit about Sega.
Who's ready for some knowledge? Are you? Huh? Yeah, you are? Well, let's begin. Sega started in Japan around, plot twist, Sega began in America. Didn't expect that, did you? To know the true history of Sega, we must go way back, almost to the same time frame where Nintendo began, the GI generation. Imagine this. You live in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet, and you see a large influx of military personnel, and World War II was slowly building up. But in 1934, the war hadn't even kicked off. There were indeed wheels in motion. That same year, three guys by the name of Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert decided to take advantage of an economic opportunity when they noticed that service members in the military really didn't have many fun things to do around Hawaii. But what did they do? They created standard games and focused on making slot machines. Pretty cool, right?
Stop, please, no more. Slots bad.
Former President Truman, what are you doing
Johnson
here?
Act.
Oh yeah, the Johnson Act. This law basically said that it is prohibited to intentionally transport any gambling device into any state or possession of the United States. Ouch, yeah. That could be bad for business. So what do? Well, we hired two people to go to a place where gaming is booming. Japan. Sure, Japan just bombed the shit out of us and severely crippled our US Pacific fleet. But to be honest, Martin Bromley never really had any opinion on it and was a true professional despite all the war that was going on around him. 1952, he sent two key individuals, Richard Stewart and Ray Lemaire, to Tokyo, bringing the magic of the one-armed bandit to Tokyo. A year later, the name would change to Service Games of Japan, leading to the name change Sega, portmanteau of the actual company's name. Over time, they would release tons of slot machines, such as the famous Sega Diamond 3-Star, to focus on more and more games up until the 60s. In 1960, Service Games of Japan was no more. But don't lose hope. When there's a great idea, especially one that's successful, there's bound to be a renaissance of sorts. This is accomplished by two independent companies, Nihon Goraku Busan Pan Entertainment Products and Nihon Kikai Seizo, Japanese machinery manufacturing. Now these two businesses kept the Sega idea afloat, the latter working on Sega machines while the former was working on coin-op, well, everything, especially jukeboxes, which were rising in popularity thanks to the 1960s. Fast forwarding to 1964, Kikai Seizo and Goraku Busan were officially merged. Service Games Hawaii, which was the American version of Sega at the time, was sold that same year as well.
Would you believe me if I said that the military had some actual influence in the creation of Sega as we know it? Sure, the slot machines in Hawaii were a fun thing for sailors and more to enjoy, but did you know the Air Force had something to do with it as well? David Rosen, who was a military officer stationed in Japan, kind of had the same mindset as Martin Bromley and others, and decided to set up what was known as the 2-minute photo booth, which was super successful. As this business venture grew, he created his own company, Rosen Enterprises. Now, where does this tie in? Well, in 1957, his company began importing coin-op games into Japan. This attracted the attention of Nihon Goraku Busan, who acquired Rosen Enterprises and then installed Rosen as the CEO of a brand new company Sega Enterprises Limited. Sega would continue to release tons of coin-operated games throughout the 60s, such as Periscope, The Punching Bag, Sega Basketball, and Duck Hunt? Wait, yep, Duck Hunt. It was a little bit different though. In the late 60s, Sega was sold to Gulf and Western. If only he would have known what the 70s would have brought to the video game industry. You see, in the 70s, we had what was known as the golden age of the arcade. Businesses racked in millions of dollars with their arcade games to include Taito's Space Invaders, Atari's Anti-Aircraft, Asteroids, and Star Raiders. Namco even had Galaga, Galaxian, and so much more. Eventually, Sega would acquire Gremlin Industries and make their mark with the 1979 release of Head-On, a sort of maze-like game where you collect dots. It is believed that this game inspired Namco's Pac-Man, which will come out a year later.
In the 1980s, the first generation of gaming was paving the way for the second generation. And to be honest, the first generation was extremely focused on minimalistic graphics, and it can be chalked up as two words: Pong clones. Because of this, arcades tended to be more popular. But once the second generation of gaming began, we saw more than just attempts to doctor up Pong, and instead saw the idea of bringing the arcade home start to truly flourish. In the 80s, the arcade spectrum was starting to fall apart because video games were becoming a more cost-effective way of playing your favorite arcade games, and more at home, literally. In fact, this generation was heavily fueled by the success of arcade games. That's how Atari was able to capitalize so heavily before the crash of 1983. Smart companies tended to parallel their arcade releases, and when Sega saw how much money they were losing to home console market, they decided to become smart. In the administrative sector, the Sega was sold by Gulf and Western to Bally Manufacturing, well known for their pinball machines, but they still allowed Sega to do what they did best: make high-quality arcade games, leading to titles such as Zaxxon, Carnival, Space Fury, and Astro Blaster. Hayao Nakayama felt that Sega should dip its toes into the home console market. After all the cool kids were doing it. And in 1983, Sega would release its first video game console, the SG-1000, which was only released in Japan and unfortunately wasn't really successful. And the true reason why it had some minor success was because Nintendo released a console at the time called the Family Computer or Famicom, which had a massive recall, but Sega's hardcore devotion to avoiding third-party developers would be their Achilles heel, pushing the Famicom back into the spotlight after they fixed their technical setback. The SG-1000 would be released again as the SG-1000-2, changing some of the aesthetic designs to include the Sega cards, the precursor to the NEC TurboGrafx 16 Hue cards. But the next major release would be Mark III, but we knew it as a little different on our side of the pond. Enter the Sega Mark III, known as the Sega Master System in the US and Europe. This console was meant to combat the powerhouse that was Nintendo, but they didn't do so well. Here's why. Nintendo had a reputation of limiting the amount of games created by third-party developers, ultimately limiting the amount of games these third-party developers could release to avoid oversaturation of the market, a safe but effective move. Sega, on the other hand, was cool with other developers making games for their console after refusing them for a while, but they didn't sell well, even with that tactical advantage in production over Nintendo. By the way, when we say third-party developers, we only mean two companies, Parker Bros and Activision. And if you add in that Tonka, who refused to localize many of the games released on the Sega Master System, you have a recipe for financial ruin in a lucrative market. By the time 1992 rolled around, it was time to end the Sega Master System, but something much more powerful came to be in 1988.
The Sega Master System is considered to be one of the longest-living consoles in history, but by no means was it the most popular. Sega knew that they messed up with letting Tonka handle the marketing for the Sega Master System, and it evolved into different forms, but they were just hardware revisions, or in the case of future releases, hardware reductions. Tonka clearly had no remote clue what they were doing on the behalf of Sega, so they got canned. So what happened? They hired CEO Michael Katz, who used to work at Atari, to spearhead the new Sega of America. In 1988, Sega released something called the Mega Drive. But guess what else came out that year? Super Mario Bros. 3. This being said, Sega noticed that they were missing one thing, especially when it came to their digital opponent, Mario. A powerful mascot that could not only be on a powerful system, but also would be a major contender against Mario, who was ultimately controlling the market. Previously, Sega relied on their pseudo-mascot Alex Kidd, which was featured in numerous games, but they needed something fast. The big promotion for the Sega Mega Drive, which would inevitably be called the Genesis, was that the hardware was faster than the Master System. Say hello to Mr. Needlemouse. Well, that doesn't sound right. A teal hedgehog with red shoes. How about we name him Sonic? Make him a hedgehog. He can still be fast, but make him less teal, more spines, a pinch of attitude, emphasis on fast. There we go. That'll do. Speaking of fast, the mascot, and more importantly the game that said mascot would be applied to, needed to be fast. This was led by a man named Yuji Naka, who created a tech demo involving a rapidly refreshing algorithm that would allow video game sprites to move almost completely fluidly throughout the level. This would go on to inspire Sonic the Hedgehog, and boy, it was a powerful game. It was so powerful that it shot the Genesis into the forefront of the 16-bit era of gaming, creating a bitter rivalry with the Super Nintendo. The Genesis cost less, it had a much larger library, and for once, Sega seemed to have an advantage over the competition, leading to a memorable ad campaign against Nintendo saying that Genesis does what Nintendo don't. This ad campaign was notorious, but it didn't bring home the bacon per se, and Michael Katz's time as CEO of Sega of America was slowly coming to an end, but we'll get there in a second. In 1989, Nintendo would release the monochrome Game Boy, or the Brick, a departure from the standard handheld games that Nintendo was releasing at the time, known as Game & Watch. Sega busted in the room with fists raised and said, "Nintendo!" loudly, and the gears went into motion, no pun intended, to create the answer to the Game Boy, the Game Gear. The Game Gear was drastically different from the Game Boy. It had tactical advantages that many people complained about with the Game Boy. For example, the Game Boy was monochrome, meaning it was shades of gray on a subtle field of green, and if you didn't have a backlight, then you were pretty much screwed until you could afford third-party add-ons. The Game Gear had a backlit screen and a full range of colors. Basically, in my humble opinion, this was the way to bring Genesis-like games on the road. Sega even said that people who played the Game Boy were obese, and true story, even one of the advertisements said this. But it had its issues. For one, it ate batteries like a child at the movie theater eating popcorn. It had a sort of weird glare-like effect on the screen. It's just something you would have to see in person to understand. Also, despite being a stronger piece of hardware, the Game Gear had a rather small library. Only about 300 games were released for it, and Sega ultimately was too busy focusing on the home console market to support the Game Gear. In 1995, Sega would introduce in tandem the Nomad with the Game Gear, which was literally a portable Genesis, but it didn't last too long, ending in 1997. Over 30.75 million units of the Sega Genesis were sold to date, but Sega wasn't anywhere done with their cash cow.
Coffee? Tea?
Sega!
In the mid-90s, Sega was not impressed with Michael Katz's leadership of the company or the sales figures for Sega of America. This inevitably led to Michael Katz being replaced by Tom Kalinske, who was the person responsible for tons of Mattel products, including Barbies, Hot Wheels, and Masters of the Universe. He would even go on to be the CEO of Matchbox before Sega of America picked him up. Truth is, Kalinske knew nothing about video games, so he launched an extremely aggressive ad campaign against Nintendo.
He was normally a very quiet boy.
Damn, that scream brings back some memories. Kalinske made a few major changes in tandem with his ad campaign. He replaced Altered Beast with Sonic the Hedgehog, reduced the price of the Sega Genesis, and provided the numbers that Japan was looking for during the 16-bit era of gaming. But the 90s was a battleground for experimentation, and various different companies put their games on various mediums. Historically, games were either on board, for example early Pong games, or cards such as the Magnavox Odyssey. The Sega Master System utilized a card-based medium as well, but many contenders in the video game industry were hard set on using cartridges. Nintendo in particular loved the cartridge-based medium and stuck with that during their NES and SNES era of gaming, which went well into the 90s. However, many companies were recognizing that the CD was potentially going to be the future of gaming. The Commodore CD-TV and the Philips CDI were among the first to recognize this and commercialize the CD in the video game arena. It didn't take long for Sega to craft their own take on it. The Mega CD was released in late 1991 in Japan and was released as the Sega CD in America a year later. It served as an add-on to the Model 1 and Model 2 Genesis. For the Model 1, it simply was mounted on the bottom with an intricate metal bracket, and the Model 2 simply slid in the side. The hardware was phenomenal for the time. In fact, the Sega CD was way ahead of the game when it came to using CDs for games, but they ran into a familiar issue. An innovation that was simply way too early for the people to understand, and as such, CD-based platforms tended to fail in the early 90s. This economic failure led Sega to jump back to the arcade spectrum, releasing amazing arcade games such as Fortefyre and, well, Virtua Everything. But yet again, Sega fell short in terms of support and the library wasn't there. The Sega CD may have been an innovation, but it didn't last long. This was one of the first red flags for the public that Sega might be heading down a pretty rough road. In 1994, Sega decided to make another technical innovation to push themselves into the 32-bit era with a cost-effective add-on to the Genesis, called the 32X, which was made because of the pressure that Sega of America felt from Atari coming out of left field and creating the 64-bit Jaguar. And in the meantime of the 32X coming out, Sega of Japan was designing their own 32-bit system by the name of the Sega Saturn. The 32X aimed to beat the Jaguar for the time being, giving Sega the edge to compete against the Jaguar before the Saturn was released. The 32X came out in January of 1994, but the Saturn came out in November of 1994, and the 32X from the beginning was simply doomed to fail. Sure, it made the Genesis even more powerful, but the rush release only led to about 40 games being released, and in the end it was considered a massive commercial failure. Another red flag under Kalinski's tenure.
The 32X was definitely not a system that Sega should have been thought about making. The Saturn, however, was a totally different story. People were 100% excited for the Saturn, and in Japan, it beat out the PlayStation. The Saturn, in many individuals' opinion, was the #1 way to play arcade games in almost one-to-one quality when compared to arcade releases. The only other system that can claim that would be Neo Geo, but the cost of Neo Geo was extremely high. So many people turned to Saturn for their arcade-at-home thrills. Not only that, there were tons of memorable series that started or were spotlighted on the Saturn. For example, Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, as well as Nights into Dreams, which already a cult classic for Saturn as it is, but it was missing one thing: Sonic. Every single console release since the Sega Master System had an installment in the Sonic series. Even the 32X had a Sonic spin-off called Knuckles Chaotix, but the Saturn was planning for a release of the Sonic game called Sonic Extreme, but it was cancelled. Initial generation releases from Sega always seemed to be given such praise, but Sega had a genuine issue with maintaining their systems, and their management was slowly crumbling. Part of the reason they failed was that they put all their chips on the Genesis surviving the 90s, and that overestimate costed them dearly. Eventually, Kalinski was replaced by Shoichiro Irimajiri, who previously was an executive for Honda, who took the seat during the major failure period when the Saturn began to decline. And despite a new CEO, David Rosen and Nakayama, the original creators of Sega we know and love today, also resigned from their positions, leaving a hole for former Sony Computer Entertainment of America executive Bernie Stoller. The advertisements that we once knew and loved in the 90s turned into tame attempts at salvaging the Saturn, as the Nintendo's N64 and Sony's PlayStation rose to popularity and claimed their place in history as more popular options. Sega's stocks plummeted and financial losses in 1999 amounted to roughly 43 billion yen, which in 1999 equaled roughly $377 million, and adjusted for inflation in 2019, roughly $490 million. Let's just say things were looking really bleak for Sega in the late 90s, and they were laying off people left and right. But despite losing such a large amount of money, Sega decided to continue trying to push a console out, this time calling it the Dreamcast. Much like previous releases of their consoles, the public ate it up, pre-ordering more than Sega was capable of making, mostly because the hardware inside malfunctioned. That being said, they had to scrap pre-orders, but even with the launch price of 29,000 yen, their stock at initial launch was cleared. Had they had the means to mass produce more at the time of launch, they could have potentially sold 200,000 to 300,000 more units, but they didn't. The supply simply couldn't match the demand, and Stoller was soon released from duty as CEO of Sega of America. Then, out of nowhere, the Dreamcast became a massive hit in the United States. Sega even set a record by making $98.4 million in a single day. Then, right when success was around the corner, they had another critical hardware failure. Sega once again watched their slight success during launch being overshadowed by PlayStation and the soon-to-come PlayStation 2. At the turn of the millennium, Sega took the last major crippling loss of 42.88 billion yen. This in turn affected the arcade market, where Sega was forced to close 246 arcade locations. By 2000, Sega was no longer a hardware manufacturer, closing a chapter of one of the most famous video game companies of the 90s. One final Dreamcast was created, and it was signed by all of Sega's 9 internal video game development studios and was given away as a fateful goodbye as part of a promotional giveaway for GamePro magazine.
Sega didn't fold as a company, they just shifted their creative ambition to something totally different, software manufacturing and development. They even changed their name from Sega Enterprises to the Sega Corporation. However, the financial losses, even from a development standpoint, were far too great. But there was good news. Sammy Holdings, who was known in Japan for pachinko machines, purchased 22.4% of Sega, leading to many Sega-based pachinko and patchy slot games. Sega continued to manufacture arcade games. If you take a walk through the Akihabara district of Tokyo, you will see numerous tall, commanding Sega arcade towers filled to the brim with people who love and enjoy contemporary Sega games. Despite not having any contemporary systems, the magic of Sega can still be found in these places. Just take a seat and you'll see so many generations of people taking the time out of their day to do something they love and are passionate about. In the pachinko houses throughout Japan, you'll see blue Sega lights accompanied with the loud sounds of pachinko balls, the smell of cheap cigarettes, and the slow whispers of subtle conversation. Where Sega once stood proudly among the competitors, they've embedded themselves as a staple of the culture, and that is a beautiful thing. Since the early 2000s, Sega has been a major name in developing games in the Sonic series as well as Yakuza, which has been extremely popular as of late, and Sega is slowly recovering from their massive financial losses. The story of Sega is one of innovation and advancement in a time where such innovations were not really well received. More often than not, the 90s cherished the late bloomers and criticized the forward thinkers, but despite such losses, Sega survived. They overcame their shortcomings, cut their losses, and continue to be a household name to this day. Well, we've talked a little bit about the history of Sega, but let's talk a little bit about the franchises that Sega has introduced to the gaming world. Please note, Sega made tons of arcade games. We're talking over 500 easily over the years. Because of this, we are only focusing on franchises created by only Sega. In the future, we might consider doing an episode on all the Sega arcade games, but for the time being, we are only covering the franchises. Let's begin.
I have an exceptional love-hate relationship with this series because I absolutely love flying games, but I cannot stand Afterburner. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the series, it's a combat flight simulator arcade game created by Sega AM2, which was the primary arcade development team for Sega in 1987. The arcade cabinet actually moved depending on if the arcade owners installed it, so that was pretty cool. In the game, you fly an F-14 over 18 missions, and it was a commercial success, much like many of the Sega arcade games around the 80s. As mentioned earlier in the video, Sega had a system by the name of the SMS, or Sega Master System, and this game was on that system. And once that happened, it was pretty much free range to put it on anything that the game could play on, including the NES and Famicom. Afterburner 2 was released that same year with the same plane, the same cockpit, the same style, and the same everything. And it was also extremely successful. In fact, many people consider Afterburner 2 to be in the top 100 games in the Genesis, and was also heavily ported to systems such as the Amiga, Atari ST, Famicom, Sharp X68000, and even the PC Engine. But look at this! That's wrong. Fix it. That's an F-15. This is an F-14. This is an F-15. The next entry in the Afterburner series wouldn't be called Afterburner at all. It was an arcade game called G-Lock Air Battle. G-Lock for you non-aviation or non-military folk is the G-force-induced loss of consciousness. And if you're curious what that looks like, well, this is it.
Yeah, you're just gonna hang out there. Just pull back on the stick, relax, and just hang out.
All right.
There's no more steps in this process.
All right.
Just We'll talk on the other side.
That sounds good.
Tell us what the wizard looks like.
Enjoy your trip.
All right. Sounds good. I'm ready.
All right, sweet dreams.
All right.
I've personally played this game and I happen to enjoy it, but it was on the Game Gear, which isn't bad at all. Actually, check it out if you get a chance. It also spawned a manga. Fun fact. Afterburner 3 was released in 1991. Again, the same style, the same everything. The game itself was a port of Strike Fighter, which was the sequel to G-Lock. This time it was Afterburner 3 only released on 2 consoles, the Sega CD and the FM Towns.
Wait, hold on, wait. What in the actual fuck is an FM Towns? Also conveniently called the Efu Emu Townzu. In Nippon Land. Weeaboos, do not yell at me for pronouncing that probably wrong. It's not my fault. I'm culturally an idiot. I'm sorry.
Well, FM Towns was a Japanese computer. You may have heard of the FM Towns Marty.
Oh, no. Oh, Marty.
Yeah, Marty. It was like a Sega CD, just worse. Kind of like the Amiga's 32 CD in the earlier attempts of CD-based games. As a game, it looked really good. The next entry, Afterburner Climax, was originally just an arcade game, but eventually it was ported to contemporary consoles. In the game, you could choose between 3 aircraft, the FA-18 Super Hornet, the F-15 Strike Eagle, or the F-14 Tomcat people already knew and loved. The game was average, but people still enjoyed it as a home conversion of a popular arcade series that was still generating revenue. The final entry in the series was released in 2007 called Black Falcon, and unlike previous releases of the game, it never really had an arcade entry. It was only released on the PSP. It was also exceptionally average. Since then, nothing really has ever been made or even mentioned. The game did have a sort of cousin in 1995's Sky Target, but other than that, there really hasn't been... Was that an Air Force Thunderbird? You can play as a Thunderbird? The non-combat coded, non-combat capable team of F-16s that entertains people for a living? What the fuck, Sega? Anyway, with a bunch of Afterburner titles, they tend to fall short of what people nowadays expect, which ultimately is Ace Combat.
Before Sonic took the helm as the poster child for Sega, Alex Kidd was rocking the Sega Master System to the best of his ability. The first title released in 1986 was called Alex Kidd in Miracle World and was released as a pack-in for the Sega Master System and Master System 2 consoles. In fact, to find out which version of the Sega Master System you had, all you had to do was boot up the console. Different versions had different games already previously installed on the console. However, there was a cartridge release, and it is considered the rarest Sega Master System game to date. The game plays as a lovable platformer that had puzzles, obstacles, and replayability. The sequel, Alex Kidd Lost Stars, initially started out as an arcade game, which was inevitably ported to the Master System in 1986 and features the titular character and his sidekick Stella looking for the zodiac signs. As a sequel, it was successful, and yet again, Sega knew this was their cash cow on the Master System. The next entry would be Alex Kidd BMX Trials, which was Japanese only, and featured a paddle controller because it was a racing game of all things. Generally, from the public perspective, it was reviewed as a poor entry because it departed from the regular formula that was expected with Alex Kidd games, but not much is known outside of that. The next entry in the series would be Alex Kidd High-Tech World in 1987, but it wasn't truly an Alex Kidd title. In fact, it was a rebrand of a game by the name of Anmitsuhime, which was based on a manga. The game was weird and the key characters were scrapped, leaving many consumers who were unaware of the remake, much like Doki Doki Panic when it came to Super Mario Bros. 2. It was a lot more difficult, but it still handled well. All in all, it wasn't nearly as popular as before, and Sega quickly scrambled to bring back what was familiar with the franchise, right around the time the Mega Drive was being released. The sole Genesis release of Alex Kidd would be Alex Kidd Enchanted World, a direct sequel of the original game, but it was bad. Consumers who were familiar with the game series absolutely hated it, and it was commercially unsuccessful. The final entry would be released back on the Master System in 1990 called Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, which was a parody of another critically acclaimed series in Sega library, Shinobi. It played like a Shinobi game, but people loved it. Despite the controls being different, the game was a commercial success and was a fantastic send-off for a legacy series Sega created. In contemporary settings, he is only mentioned in cameos and subtle references.
When you think of the Sega Genesis, you likely think of two titles, Sonic the Hedgehog or Altered Beast. But let's be honest, Altered Beast wasn't a great game. The arcade version was a massive success, but when it was parked on the Genesis parking lot, it stagnated. It was an example of an arcade port not maintaining the power of the original arcade game. People loved it because it was memorable, but it was not by any means a high-selling game, unless you account for the fact that it was a pack-in game at some point during the Genesis lifecycle. There was a remake in 2005 for the PS2, but it was a weird attempt at reviving an average-at-best game in the Genesis library. Even Screw Attack said in 2009 that it was one of the top 10 worst games to make the transition from 2D to 3D. There have been revisions to the original entry, but I think it's fair to say this one died with the Genesis. Also, my personal opinions on Altered Beast is it's a heaping pile of dog shit. I left this in there just for you, Fortefyre. I played the game recently and I didn't have a good time. It was pretty bad. Pretty bad. And by pretty bad, I mean it was probably one of the worst Sega Genesis games I've ever played. I remember playing it as a kid and I could never get past the first level. No matter what I did, I couldn't figure it out. Didn't know what to do. I beat the game this time around, but it just controls like... I don't know. The best way to describe it is if you took your controller and you held it in one hand, and with the other hand, you served yourself up a big bowl of mashed potatoes. And then for whatever reason, you decided that you wanted to dunk the controller inside the heaping hot pile of mashed potatoes and try to play the game while the controller was submerged in it. It just fucking sucks.
If you enjoy mecha combat games, this one is for you. Border Break is an arcade game that took Japan, Hong Kong and Taiwan by storm in 2009. It was unique in the aspect that you could tie multiple arcade units together to make up to a 20-player battle royale. It's interesting to say the least. The only downfall is that the screen is kind of small. But it was an arcade smash hit in a contemporary setting and even saw a PlayStation 4 port that is free to play. Check it out if you ever find yourself in Japan.
Clockwork Knight. This game was an early attempt at a 2.5D on Sega Saturn, but it's really clunky, like bad clunky. It had good depth perception, but as you can see from the footage, it's a wacky, wonky side-scrolling platform adventure that really confused consumers because it looked weird, but it played relatively well. If you want an easy game on the Saturn, look no further. The sequel, known as Clockwork Knight 2, was also well received, and was basically the same game in terms of concept, and even Electronic Gaming Monthly said it was a must-have title. I'll let you decide for yourself. Every great company had a puzzle game. Nintendo had Tetris and Puyo Puyo, Capcom had Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, and even Tengen had Clax. But Sega had something by the name of Columns. If it wasn't for Columns, we wouldn't have titles such as Candy Crush, Jewel Quest, and other tile-matching styled games. Columns was inspired by Tetris to some capacity, but changed the format to be a different style of game. It was also, interestingly enough, the first pack-in game for the Genesis, ultimately being replaced by Altered Beast. Almost every console possible had a version of Columns, including the Game Boy Color. The game was notorious for being crisp, clean, and responsive puzzle game that created 3 sequels and 2 more spiritual sequels. It paved the way for tons of tile matching games, and still to this day is an amazing game and must-have title by Sega.
This game was developed by Hitmaker, but let's not forget, Hitmaker was formerly known as Sega AM3, one of the many Sega subsidiaries. They just renamed their company. This game is a cult classic, not only in the arcades, but also on the Dreamcast. Basically, what you do is drive around and ferry people around, picking up and dropping off people as fast as possible by any means necessary, gaining points by doing awesome stunts. It was an idea crazy enough for Sega to patent it in 2001, leading to a rather strong lawsuit from Sega against The Simpsons' Road Rage. The public will never know how much Electronic Arts settled with Sega for, but it's fair to say, no company has come even remotely close to mimicking Crazy Taxi because of that one patent. Crazy Taxi 2 would be the next release in 2001 and was only made for the Dreamcast and PlayStation Portable. The only major improvement was that the driver in the game could pick up multiple people in his taxi, and you could hop over obstacles. It's a must-have title on the Dreamcast. Unfortunately, the third release fell short of consumer expectation and was only released for Windows and the Xbox. At that point, the series died, with final two releases being Crazy Taxi Catch a Ride on the Game Boy Advance and Crazy Taxi Flare Wars on the PlayStation Portable.
I've actually played Daytona USA, but it was a release in 2010 called Sega Racing Classic. But the original game came out in 1993, and much like Border Break was multiplayer if you chained together units to perform with each other. The game was amazing. Sega always was spot on with arcade games, and this was no exception. I'm personally not into racing games, but this one was one that I thoroughly enjoyed. The public loved it too, and it was the recipient of the American Amusement Machine Association Diamond Award in 1995. It was so influential that the Daytona USA Museum next to the actual speedway had quite a few copies of this cabinet. The game was inevitably ported to the system appropriate at the time, the Saturn, which wasn't as effective because the game required a decent draw distance of which the Saturn was not capable of at the time. The frame rate itself dropped from 60 FPS to a fucking holy 20 FPS. This didn't stop Sega though, who released a revision of the game called Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition in 1996. It was longer, improved on the software limitations, but people still felt the arcade was really difficult to replicate. Two more sequels were created, with the most recent being Daytona USA 2001 on the Dreamcast, but you can still find this arcade cabinet alive and well. I actually saw it at Chuck E. Cheese the other day. This is a strange one. This game involves breeding, training, and inevitably racing your horses on an arcade platform. If you've played it, you've likely purchased a memory card that you would plug in, take a seat, and race against other people. It's been revised multiple times, and it's a great time waster, but you have to be interested in the concept, which for me is rather boring. But people in Japan love this, and if you don't believe me, go to the Sega Arcade Towers in Akihabara.
Speaking of arcade games that use cards, they are a massive hit in Japan. There are various takes on it from different companies, and here is how it works. People would buy card packs depending on the game, and the cards either have electronics or a barcode that the game would recognize. Traditionally, there's a flat screen called the playing field that one would lay down the cards on, and a video screen showing what is happening on the game. Dinosaur King had a large barcode scanner in the center, and the cards were the size of postcards. With these cards, you could move your character, be used to learn super moves, get new dinosaurs and new characters. It's a nifty game that generated a DS port and spun off quite a popular anime in Japan.
Doki Doki Penguin Land is a puzzle platformer that began on the MSX and the SG-1000. It's a traditional platformer, and the only objective is to move an egg to the bottom of whatever stage you are at by moving and/or destroying blocks. There is fall damage for the egg, so players have to be smart about the distance that the egg falls. The game was heavily ported, but even before that happened, Sega decided to make a sequel for the Sega Master System called Doki Doki Penguin Randu Uchi Daibuken. I can't speak Japanese, so basically it says Thump Thump Penguin Land Outer Space Adventure. Mouthful, huh? It's the most well-known of the trilogy, and it's a little bit different. The simple puzzle aspect was traded for an out-of-this-world, no pun intended, storyline that made little no sense, but it was a novelty game that you should have if you own a Sega Master System. The final title was called Doki Doki Penguin Land MD, which was a downloadable game for the Genesis. That's right, downloadable. How? Well, the Sega products in Japan were known to have off-the-wall peripherals like the FM tuner for the Game Gear. A lot of people think that the Dreamcast was the first console to have internet access, but it was the Genesis, with the Sega MegaNet modem, which costed about $100 at the time. It was a subscription-based service where the individual would pay about $8 and have access to downloading games. Returning the game, it was almost the same as the first entry, and it was pretty much as successful as that game. The series ultimately faded away with the failure of the Sega MegaNet. This is one of the more famous RPGs Sega created compared to another one we'll get to in a second. Dragon Force was released in 1996 on the Sega Saturn, and it's a beautiful game. I'm talking beautiful. The art, the mechanics, the storyline, everything just seemed to work out for this game. The best way that I can describe it is take everything you know about traditional RPGs and throw them out the window. This game is an RPG, but it pits about 200 soldiers fighting in real time, and it's awesome. It did generate one sequel, Dragon Force 2, Kamisarishi Daiichi ni, in 1998, which followed the same idea and looked just as great, but was a reworking of the first game, just a little bit smaller. I personally like to consider it Dynasty Warriors on a much smaller scale.
Dynamite Cop is a beat-em-up, well, a relatively newer beat-em-up released in 1998, which some people still consider new for retro games. It was released in arcades and saw a sold port with the Dreamcast. Basically, you play as one of 3 characters and fight your way through a cruise ship to save the president's daughter from pirates. It was incredibly meh as a game, with the worst issue being the camera and random QuickTime events that took forever to load. Imagine this, you are fighting with the camera zoomed in, then boom, you need to dodge a nuke flying through the roof. You hit the control stick in the direction it mentions, then you wait 6 seconds. 6 seconds to see if you succeeded or failed. Look at this. The fighting is clunky, the voice acting is cheesy, and the game is all over the place. If you haven't heard of this title, then maybe you know the predecessor that inspired it, Die Hard Arcade, which was also made by Sega, but Sega couldn't call it that in Japan because of licensing issues, so it was called Dynamite Detective. The more you know, right?
We already covered this game in the last episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show. So if you want to learn about Sega's off-the-wall comic book art-inspired fighting game and its wholly unrelated sequels, then check out the previous episode. Here we go. This is a legacy franchise created, developed, and smoked out of a crack pipe by Sega. This game sort of worked in tandem with Konami's Twin Bee to create the shoot-'em-up genre, which is a shoot-'em-up that's simply adorable in design and application. It's a simple game, and if you ever get a chance to play it, do it. It was released on pretty much every system, and if you ever buy a Sega collection, you can bet you'll find it on there. It has a sort of impact that can even still be felt in contemporary gaming, as it's a mini-game found in Yakuza 0, which takes place in 1988. The game is best described as Defender with cute elements, and if you play it, you'll know exactly what we mean. It generated around 5 sequels, and it's awesome. Check it out.
Virtua Fighter wasn't the only fighting franchise that Sega focused on. While Virtua Fighter came out in 1993, Fighting Vipers came out in 1995 in the arcade and saw a Saturn release a year later. This game featured various features that were common at the time, with the only major competitors being Tekken and Soul Calibur. It had a base roster of 11 characters, and if you had the Japanese version, then you had access to a secret 12th character known only as Pepsi Man. Obviously, for licensing reasons, this didn't stick outside of Japan, so the US and PAL releases didn't have it. But hey, cool little product placement. The game itself was based on the Virtua Fighter 2 engine, and it was highly well received. And the Saturn in particular was extremely successful. There was a sequel called Fighting Vipers 2 released in 1998 for the arcades, but the port on the Dreamcast was limited in scope to the European and Japanese markets. Again, it was highly received. In contemporary settings, the game is only mentioned in cameos and select characters can be found in other games, such as Capcom's Project X Zone.
Ghost Squad. Oh boy, Ghost Squad. I spent so much money on this game in the arcades. If you're unfamiliar with it, this game was almost always next to Silent Scope, Time Crisis, or whatever popular light gun game was around the corner. It was incredibly fun, too. The weapon you used was modeled after a real-life firearm, and it even featured recoil, which was a nice touch from Sega. If you've played Time Crisis in arcades, then you've played Ghost Squad, but the only big difference was that you could manage your firearms and change your outfits for a subpar attempt at replayability. It was released eventually on the Wii throughout the world. The sequel, of which I never played nor even knew existed, was called Ghost Squad Evolution and expanded on the focus of the light gun or rifle, if you will, that the player controlled. All in all, it's your run-of-the-mill arcade light gun game. Golden Axe is a beat-em-up released in 1989 and was developed by the same guy who made Altered Beast, and you can kind of tell that in the style and application that it's somewhat similar. Golden Axe was reminiscent of Conan the Barbarian, and the game itself is often considered one of the greatest games of all time. Since its conception, it's been released on 13 platforms, even seeing a release on the Commodore 64. Yeah, wrap your head around that one. After the original Golden Axe, the series split into 2 parallel releases, with one path being released on the home consoles and the other being a different game in the arcades. At home, people received Golden Axe 2 as a sequel, featuring the same characters from the original entry. It was basically the same game with sprinkles on top. In the arcades, the sequel was called Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, who was the antagonist of the original game. This one featured multiple paths and got rid of all the characters that we knew from the original game. To be honest, it kinda seemed like D&D Tower of Doom was somewhat inspired by this game, especially given the multiple paths. But of course, Capcom handled it a little bit different. Jumping back to the Genesis, Golden Axe 3 was released and would be the final main entry of the series, and despite being a fun addition to the series with added characters, moves, and more, it was actually kind of a step back when it came to graphics, and people didn't receive the game as well as the others. The final arcade version would be Golden Axe The Duel, but by the time it came out in arcades, the public was tired of the concept. There were tons of characters, which is cool and all, but the idea was run dry. The controls were extremely difficult, and it was considered kind of shitty. Plus, it was a fighting game, so yeah, it was only a Golden Axe game in theory. Even with a Saturn release of the game, it didn't sell well. There were 3 spin-offs, one for the Game Gear, one for the SMS, and one for the PS3. You know what, I'm not asking any questions, I just find it to be easier that way.
Hang on. This one is classic. We already covered the racing game earlier, but this was the game that people really enjoyed. It was a motorcycle racing game developed by a guy named Yu Suzuki. And no, if you're curious, Suzuki the motorcycle company had nothing to do with this game. It's just ironic. Basically, in the game, you control a motorcycle racer reaching checkpoints. It is a simple concept, but it was done well, especially in the arcades where there were 3 versions. The only primary differences in these versions were the controls. In the original run of the game, you had a stand-up cabinet with handlebars, which you would turn. The second revision added a bench in front of the cabinet, and the third and most popular version had a physical motorcycle that you would have to lean. When you see contemporary motorcycle racing games in the arcades, think back to this idea by Sega. It really did inspire that. In the home console market, Hang On was a packing game, literally built into the hardware. To access it, all you had to do was to turn on the console without any game in the console. It was also featured in compilations for the Sega Master System on 2 separate cards, one with Astro Warrior and the other with Safari Hunt. There was a sequel called Hang On 2, but it was a SG-1000 exclusive, which was the same game as the original, just downscaled to work for the console. The true sequel many people remember in the arcades and at home was Super Hang On, released in 1987. This one was simply beautiful, and you could drive on tracks around the world. In the Genesis version, you could even race to obtain sponsorship money to upgrade your bike. The Saturn would feature the major final entry in the series called Hang On GP95 in Japan, Hang On GP in the US, and finally called Hang On GP96 in Europe. This entry was the same formula, just poorly executed. Since then, Hang On was mainly being mentioned in cameos, and nothing new has been done with the franchise. Hero Bank is a pretty simple RPG for the Nintendo 3DS, released in 2014. The premise of the game is that players participate in something known as hero battles, using bank fund Gs, whatever these are. You basically just fight to improve your power. There are a few characters, and we mean 18 characters, all of which are voice acted. Pretty cool. It's not too spectacular when compared to other Sega RPGs. Phantasy Star was incredibly more powerful than this one was, but it did spawn an anime, as well as an arcade entry released later that year.
Do you like horror? Do you like gun games? Do you like spooky gun games? Do you like the most common light gun game apart from Namco's Time Crisis that you were guaranteed to find at any arcade in the late 90s? Well, look no further. House of the Dead is all of that. The first game came out in 1996, and it's kind of hard. Well, it's an arcade game, so I expect it to be difficult, but it's actually hard to me and also a coin eater. But if you were lucky, you got a hold of it on the Saturn, which ran at a whopping 20 frames per second. Lightning fast hot garbage, by the way, or you had it for the PC. The series was notorious for making you plan out what your shots were because you don't have that much time to react to what's coming your way, unlike Namco's Time Crisis where you could hide from bullets and the only thing stopping you was a timer. House of the Dead 2 was released a year later and again was ported to Sega's system at the time, this time being the Dreamcast. It was also released for the Wii a while later. This time the PC version wasn't that great, but everything else was pretty fine. House of the Dead 3 was released in 2002, but by then it was an idea that was run into the ground and people were picking up that the idea was outdated. Then out of nowhere, this popped up. House of the Dead 4 was a godsend for the franchise. It was incredibly ambient in arcades because of the approach that Sega had made to make sure the player was fully enveloped in the experience. The graphics were phenomenal and people loved it. The final major entry was House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn, and look at this! This is phenomenal! This was in the arcades! Find it! But outside of that, there were some kind of funky remakes of the game. For example, Typing of the Dead, which is the same game as House of the Dead 2, but with typing. I've seen this in Japan, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see people typing in Japanese and English letters and annihilating zombies with the power of their fingertips. But hey, it's a novelty. They also had a beat 'em up called Zombie Revenge, which was kind of but all things considered, the series is definitely worth checking out.
Jet Set Radio is a cute game that involves you skating around and committing petty crimes. I'm just kidding. Vandalism isn't a petty crime, in Japan at least. Basically, you graffiti different things over the course of the game and was notorious for being one of the first games to utilize cel shading in its graphics, which made it charming to say the least. It was released in tons of platforms, but the Dreamcast version is a must-have Dreamcast title. There was a sequel called Jet Set Radio Future released in 2002, solely for the Xbox. Compared to the first game, it was alright, no more, no less. The problem was, the first game was a breakthrough for the concept, with the next game kind of falling short.
Last Bronx is a fighting game. Like Fighting Vipers and Virtua Fighter, it was released in 1996 for the arcades, but it was on the Saturn as well. There were 9 playable characters and Japanese consumers ate it up like candy. It was an extremely popular fighting game. Then it came to the US, where people really didn't care about it. Why? Well, Tekken 2 was taking the world by storm, and US consumers already had Virtua Fighter 3, which looked and handled a lot better. US gamers tend to flock to franchises that they already know, and Last Bronx was just another arcade game that got ported. Other series like Dead or Alive were also coming up in popularity, but we all know why that game was popular. It was because of the titties. The biggest thing it did was release a movie in 1997, and it sucks. Ever been to Chuck E. Cheese in the last 8 years? Then you've probably seen this light gun game. It takes place in a neat revolving seat, but more often than not, arcades didn't include this. It takes place in a jungle, and you go through levels that are set up with quick time events, power-ups, and it's a super easy game curve. Trust me, you'll enjoy it. Another popular game that isn't in the series but handles the exact same way was another fantastic Sega shooter called The Ocean Hunter, which I played in arcades growing up.
This is a girl's game. Well, it's basically one of those games that involved cards in the arcade, which, if you have been paying attention, Sega loved to do. They picked up on the idea and ran with it to hit as much of their target demographic that they could. This game features 2 characters who are fashion bitches, and basically the player just works to build up their fashionista to be the best. It's charming, but it's definitely a game aimed for the ladies, and more specifically, teenage young ladies. Monaco GP is one of the OG 70s Sega arcade classics, only released in the arcades in North America. The other versions were ports and were on the SG-1000, meaning on the European and Japanese market had access to it. It was so popular in the arcades, it was even included in the PS2 Sega Ages 2500 collection. Now, the first game might have been popular, but the follow-up was legendary. Super Monaco GP, released in 1989, almost 10 years after the first entry, featured a first-person-ish perspective and processed the gameplay perfectly. If you see this game in the arcades, play it. Trust me, you will not be disappointed. There was only one game that garnered a higher profit, and it was Namco's winning run. That's comparing 3D standards at the time to sprite work. You can be the judge of that. Mushy King, the king of Beatles. Oh hey, look, another card game. This time it's Beatles. No, not those Beatles. These Beatles. The only true claim to fame for this game was that it holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest number of tournaments held.
Around the time that Sonic & Knuckles came out, Yuji Naka had this insane idea of having a game where an angel could fly around one-to-one like a bird. This would inevitably become Nights into Dreams. If you have a Saturn, there is 100% no reason as to why you should not own this game. It's perfect. Nights into Dreams was a perfect balance of atmosphere, musical talent, and captivating graphics. It's been ported a few times, and it's a staple in the Saturn's culture. It even came with a ridiculous 3D controller that looked like a dish with buttons, but hey, that's Sega for you. There was even a mod of this game, well, kind of. It was called Christmas Nights into Dreams, and it was the same game, but just Christmas. The sequel, Knight's Journey of Dreams, came out long down the road and was exceptionally horrible compared to the original. I mean, subjectively, everything that made Knights awesome on the Saturn was scrapped to make way for this whole new 3D idea of the game, at least more 3D than before. It was also headed by Sonic Team, and their previous adventure was Sonic 06, so yeah, if you like it, you like it. If you hate it, you hate it. This game is an arcade classic, and by classic, I mean everyone had their hands in it port-wise. It was released on the arcades at first, then was released on Amstrad, Amiga, Atari ST, NEC, PC 8801, MS-DOS, PC Engine. Got it? Good. It was released on everything because the impact of this racing game was phenomenal, and the music was awesome as well. I played this in the arcade, and it's a perfect time waster that captivates the player on many different levels. In terms of arcade releases, there were 3 more after the first entry. The first was Turbo Outrun. The only major difference was that the police could pull you over and a few other minor details. In the first game, you drove to a few destinations, but in this game, you drove through different cities, sort of like Cruisin' USA. Again, it was heavily ported and well received, but the console ports were a little lacking. In the third entry, you could travel the world, and it was called Outrunners. It was also fun, but the Genesis port was absolute garbage. Don't even look at it. It even caught Atari's attention for some weird reason, which led to a lawsuit. The most contemporary arcade release was in 2003 and was called Outrun 2. It was a contemporary spin on the classic, again with a player at the helm of a Ferrari driving throughout the cities, but this time the physics of the game were the priority. All in all, outside of the 4 arcade entries, there were 6 more console games made independent of the arcade series. All of them vary in reception but remain faithful to the original title.
Panzer Dragoon. This game probably takes the cake as one of the most expensive franchises to collect in all of gaming history. But we will get to that in a second. Panzer Dragoon is a rail shooter, released in 1995, kind of like Sin and Punishment, but that was a Nintendo game. Panzer Dragoon was a gem on the Sega Saturn. The levels were designed well, the music was awesome, and each level only took about 5 minutes, so realistically it became a hot target when speedrunners picked it up. Another key point to bring up is that the player could view the area in a 360 view, where Afterburner was solely focused on objects directly in front of you. This game was highly reviewed, but not exceptionally financially successful. As a starter game for the Sega Saturn, it put the Saturn on the map hardware-wise. The other series would accommodate this feat, were mostly arcade ports that were brought home. Panzer II is the sequel that was released in 1996. By the way, if you are curious, it was developed by Team Andromeda, but don't worry, this game fits the bill. Team Andromeda used to be called Sega Sports Japan. We are glad that they changed focus away from just sports games because this one is just as awesome as the previous entry. Again, it's a rail shooter and in many ways improved on some of the concepts that were popular in the first entry. It had multiple routes, different dragon transformations, and amazing graphics for the era. Many critics held this game on a high pedestal. If you want this game loose, you will likely pay around $34, but if you want it brand new, you are looking at around $190. But you just wait, we haven't hit the big one yet. What is that? Well, it's Panzer Dragoon Saga, a massive departure from the traditional formula, which is, hilariously enough, an RPG. Nobody expected this, given that Panzer Dragoon in the past was a rail shooter. So when this one was released, it dropped the jaws of gamers across the world, like you wouldn't believe. This game was released in 1998, had voice acting, full-fledged 3-dimensional computer graphics, and still managed to incorporate the dragon battles that were popular in the first few games. But the unfortunate truth is that no matter how awesome the game was, it was sold near the end of the lifespan of the Saturn, literally one of the last games ever released. If you pay attention to the market sales of video games, this means they are rare. Look at Bubble Bobble 2, DuckTales 2, and Little Samson for example. They have a pretty penny. But Panzer Dragoon Saga, well, here is the average price for a new copy according to price charting. If you can find this game under $600, it is a steal, grab it while you can. These copies won't be on sale forever. But seriously, look at that graded price. $1,212.05? Jesus! There was one final entry in the series that released exclusively for the Xbox by the name of Panzer Dragoon Orta, which is a return to the original style of gameplay that we all knew and loved from the original 2 entries and was one of the greatest rail shooters of all time.
We already covered this fantastic RPG series in the 2nd episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show, so go check that out if you get a chance. Rent a Hero is a Japanese exclusive Mega Drive title released in 1991 and follows the story of Taro Yamada, who lives in Korja, who after ordering a pizza receives power armor and basically does heroic deeds for the local people. It's strange, but it's Japan, so what did you expect? It's an action role-playing game, and it has an isometric view, kind of like Zombies Ate My Neighbors, but in the action scenes, they take place in a 2D perspective. It looks interesting, and I would personally love to add it to my collection. There was a remake of the game for the Dreamcast that was available to Japan and North America. Well, the North American version was supposed to be on the Xbox, but it was cancelled. It was called Rent a Hero No. 1. It played basically the same, but included a female protagonist called Hiroko. Definitely give this one a chance.
Well, I'm back with more rail shooters. This time it's a musical game though. It's kind of tough to explain without actually playing it, but fun fact, the people who made it were United Game Artists, known formerly as Sega R&D 9, which had 4 members who previously worked on another game called Panzer Dragoon. Wow, full circle, huh? Anyway, it was a fun game, so definitely check it out. There have been a few contemporary re-releases under the Vibes moniker, and they are just as worthy of checking out as Rez, and the 2 remasters of the original game, known as Rez HD and Rez Infinite respectively. Sakura Wars. This one is an oddity. Imagine taking a science fiction role-playing game, adding tactical RPG aspects to include it being a visual novel, and it's a dating simulator as well. What a concoction. Anyway, this game was released for many of the systems popular in the mid-90s, with the Japanese version being the only one developed by Sega. The others were made by NIS America and Akella in Russia. That's right, Russia needed Sakura Wars to totally remove the remnants of communism. It totally happened. You can trust me. I have a sweet beard, and I'm talking on the internet. Hello? Oh? Yeah? Gotcha. Yeah, Sakura Wars had nothing to do with destroying communism, but apparently, the RGGS legal team says I can still claim I have an awesome beard. Back to the game. So this series is known for changing the progression and endings of the game depending on the choices you made, kind of a precursor to the mechanics that made BioWare RPGs so successful in terms of how choices impacted player experiences. But outside of that, it only sold very well in Japan. The sequel, Sakura Wars 2, Thou Shall Not Die, was released only in Russia and Japan, and again combined all the off-the-wall ideas that made the first game so wonky. In fact, Japan alone, the game sold 355,000 units, selling out literally in the first week. It even became the 5th highest selling Saturn title of all time. This is outrageous, Japan. Why do you do this? Anyway, this game is the best selling game in the series, and it was on Dreamcast as well. The third entry, called Sakura Wars 3, is Paris Burning. I don't know, is it? Oh. Yep. Well, I'm glad we answered that question 18 years later. The game follows the stories from Sakura Wars 2 and was exclusively released in Japan, and from that point on would continue to be only released in Japan. The fourth game, Sakura Wars 4, Fall in Love, Maidens, as well as the final entry, Sakura Wars So Long, My Love, were also great, hilariously crazy games, except the final game was released in America for the PlayStation 2 and Wii. If you want something off the wall with tons of cutscenes, check this one out.
Card game, yet again. This one's a tactical RPG, so at least this one has something going for it. The only major difference is that this game was developed by Shade and turned into a DS game in conjunction with Sega's arcade series. I've seen this one in arcades and it's a cool game, but if you don't know Japanese, you're kinda screwed. Scud Race, which contrary to popular belief is not a military game involving the transportation of tactical ballistic missiles made in Russia across the world in Grand Prix Fandango, is a racing game involving supercars. Scud stands for Super Car Ultimate Drive, but was known as Sega Super GT in America, probably because the idea of Scuds in the mid-90s was kinda touchy given the fact that they were used heavily during the Gulf War. More you know, right? The game was ultimately created as a response to fans wanting something more than Daytona racing, which was tuned to stock car racing, so Sega delivered. They continued Daytona racing, but Scud Race was the healthy alternative for those who wanted something non-NASCAR related in the arcades.
Sega Bass Fishing. The Dreamcast was sort of in a way the arena for Sega to create as many different games as they could. Often, this included sports games. This one is guaranteed to be found on the shelf at every retro game store you can imagine. It even had a fishing controller, and yes, this was an arcade game as well, which also featured the fishing rod controller. It was a common title early in the Dreamcast library, and it even had a sequel in 2001 called Sega Bass Fishing 2. If you aim to complete your Dreamcast collection, this is an easy one to find. Speaking of sports games, they weren't limited to just the Dreamcast. Sega had an entire division solely dedicated to sports games. And while Konami had Winning Eleven and EA had FIFA, Sega had Sega Worldwide Soccer. The first title wasn't called this though. Instead, it was called Victory Goal. Over time, they would release 10 more entries in the series, and as expected, it was very much the same game every year, except the graphics would increase in ability and rosters would be updated. Well, if this isn't the most cultist of cult classics on the Dreamcast, then I don't know what is. It's hard to explain this game. It's an action-adventure game kind of like Yakuza, but without all the Grand Theft Auto elements. It even takes place in a real city. To me, Shenmue is more of a masterpiece of gaming as opposed to other titles at the time. It's a very social sort of approach to gaming, and if you have hours upon hours to explore the intricacies of this game, then by all means do it. The premise of the game is that you are Ryo Hazuki, a martial artist who is investigating the death of his father. There was a sequel released in 2001, but to play it on Dreamcast, you have to play it Japanese style. The American version was instead released on the Xbox a year later and had to re-release on a PS4 and Xbox One just last year. It continues the story but offers different characters. The biggest cool aspect of the game itself is that if you had Shenmue save data, you could import news you learned over the course of the game, money, as well as key items. Recently, a crowdfunding has yielded a surprising release of concepts for Shenmue 3, so definitely be on the lookout for that.
The Shining series is a long-standing RPG series created by Sega starting in 1991 with Shining in the Darkness, where you embark on a journey in the land of Thornwood to fight the evil villain Dark Soul to find your princess and your father. Cool concept, right? Well, to be honest, it was a super low-budget game, and because of that, many people saw this game as sort of a foundation for the standard of JRPGs at the time. The other major contenders being Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Warrior. It didn't do as well as Sega's other major RPG franchise, Phantasy Star, but it still holds power in the retro gaming scene, much like the next game in the series, Shining Force. Now, Shining Force is perhaps one of the more famous Shining series games out there because it's a tactical RPG, and the only other major contender for the game was Nintendo's Fire Emblem, which if you watched episode 4 of the Ready Go Gaming Show was not nearly as popular, mostly because it was a newer concept that didn't really take off. It was highly well received and paved the way for Shining Force 2, a game that is oftentimes considered to be one of the greatest games of all time for the Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. It continued the plot as well as the mechanics from the previous game, and it's a staple on the Sega Genesis. When the Sega CD came out, Shining Force was one of the games to make the leap to the Sega CD, much like Sonic with Sonic CD. But this time, it was a remake of another game called Shining Force Gaiden and Shining Force Gaiden 2. What are those? Well, Shining Force and Shining Force 2 were kicking ass on the Genesis. Sega released two games that were Gaiden, or side story if translated from Japanese, for the Game Gear. These two games were remade for the Sega CD, leading to Shining Force CD. The more you know, right? The game was broken up into 4 books, or chapters, where the first 2 chapters were the Game Gear titles, while the later 2 were campaigns that were unique to the game. Compared to the previous Genesis entries, the game didn't do so well. When the Saturn came out, Sega released Shining Wisdom, which was frustratingly released by Sonic Software Planning, even though Sonic was never released on the Saturn, and this one's kind of weird. It took everything that made the Shining Force series what it was and tossed it to the side, opting for an action-adventure kind of perspective. It kind of looked like Legend of Zelda, but with chibi characters and a badass, catchy soundtrack. Some people liked it and some people hated it, but that didn't stop them from following it up with Shining the Holy Ark in 1996. This one returned to the idea of RPGs and brought back ideas like first-person dungeon crawling, which by 96 was really only done by Ultima and Wizardry and other games that solely focused on that perspective. And oddly enough, it pulled it off pretty well. Shining Force 3 would be the final entry on the Saturn and shifted the mechanics again to that of simulation or tactical RPGs. It had tons of characters, but they did something really fucking weird. They released the game in multiple discs called scenarios. There were 3 in total, but only the first scenario was released in America. To view the true ending of the game, you had to complete them all, so realistically, American consumers were left with a gnarly cliffhanger that was not well received.
Once the contemporary systems many of us grew up on came to prominence, Shining Tears was released, and this one featured a more heavy storyline versus what was normal with RPGs earlier in the series, where the player had to connect the dots. In Shining Tears, it had 8 endings depending on the relationships you built throughout the game. Sounds like Breath of Fire 2, huh? Despite having all these magical endings and being a contemporary spin on the Shining series, it didn't do well and kind of started to fall in the series as we know. Shining Force Neo was once again a tactical RPG. It seemed like Sega was kind of becoming desperate to keep this IP afloat. It's not even really related to any of the plot points in the older games, and it was poop. Sorry. The next one was called Shining Force EXA, and it was borderline unplayable because of the crippling lags that resulted from too much action being on the screen, and sales figures reflected that. Shining Wind in 2007, a Japanese exclusive, in some way revived the series, but only for people who put up with all the other entries that Sega was pumping out. It had an anime spin-off that likely boosted its success, but again, was only in Japan. What's that? Oh, it's Blade, Arcus from Shining. Yeah, this is a fighting game and it sucks. Like, really sucks. The only claim to fame it has is that it was the first Shining game to be featured in arcades, but that isn't saying much. The final entry was Shining Resonance Refrain, and again, it's just another jolt of lightning into a series that had ultimately been dead since the days of the Saturn. But worry not, us retro folk never forget our roots. Those Shining Force Genesis games will always stand out as some of, if not the greatest titles on the Genesis.
Shinobi is a Sega classic, but it was a highly unreliable one in my opinion. Don't sharpen your pitchforks, please. Sega just jumped all over the place with this IP, literally as much as the character does in the game. It all started in arcades in 1987 with a hack and slash titled Shinobi, where you use all these awesome techniques to kick ass and take names. It was released on the Sega Master System as well as the PC Engine. It was never on the TG16, so if you were in America, you did not have this game at home unless you had a Sega Master System. There was a sequel, oddly enough. I watched Redweird play it on Twitch this morning. It's called Shadow Dancer, but don't be fooled by the title. It is very much still a Shinobi game and it's beautiful. It was a pleasure to watch and looks even more fun to play. It was released on tons of consoles, so collect if you can. These were the only 2 arcade-era Shinobi games made. The next ones would come out in the Sega Genesis, starting with Revenge of Shinobi, also known as Super Shinobi in Japan. It is still a platformer, and it operates a lot like the previous game. Whoa! Is that Batman? Bet your sweet fucking ass it is. This game is charming, but personally, I hate it. I played it for a while, and it shit on my face more than Castlevania 3 in a matter of seconds. It's just stiff to me. And in case you're wondering, there were more than just Batman cameos. There was Rambo, the Terminator, Godzilla, and Spider-Man, all in the game. You just gotta look for them. If you beat the final boss of the game, you are a gaming god. Seriously, to me it's that tough. Now the sequel was called Shadow Dancer: The Secret of Shinobi. Wait, maybe this was the game Redweirder's playing. I don't know. But I do know that this game looks phenomenal and it plays very well. And hey, if you play it, you get to follow the story of a young ninja fighting the evil ninja cult known as Union Lizard, a gigantic demonic reptilian demon that took over New York City. This title was extremely well received, but if you don't know it was a Shinobi game, then you may have overlooked it. The next entry is perhaps the greatest entry in the Shinobi series, called Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master, and if you were like me, you were wondering where the fuck Shinobi 2 was, well hopefully we answered your question with that one. Shinobi 3 is fantastic. It's on the Ultimate Genesis Collection for a reason. Many of the popular game critics such as IGN, Eurogamer, Game Rankings, and Screw Attack adore this game, and for a good reason. It's a fun entry, and the final entry for the Genesis. Now while the Genesis Shinobi games were rocking out with their nunchucks out, much like Shining Force, there was a Shinobi Game Gear game that was drastically different from the other entries. This one had colored Shinobi all with their own individual powers, kind of like Power Rangers but ninjas. Again, they fight Neo Z to some capacity loosely, but it was a great game. Seriously, my dad had a few Game Gear games, and this was one of them. The second Game Gear title was called Shinobi 2: The Silent Fury, and it featured music from someone that you might know. Do you recognize this music? Yeah? That's the work of Yuzo Koshiro, who worked on Streets of Rage, a beat-em-up for the Genesis and a contender for the game with the most banging soundtrack on the Sega Genesis. I prefer 2, but that's a discussion for another time. Shinobi 2 maintained the same hype and power as the previous game, and it's on the top 10 list of pretty much everyone when talking about the greatest games of all time for the Game Gear, which isn't saying much, but good job, Sega. The final entries took place on the PS2 with the release of Shinobi in 2002, but to be honest, it felt like a sad attempt at what Ninja Gaiden wanted to do in the hack-and-slash territory. But don't be fooled, it's still a fun game. The sequel Nightshade, known as Kunoichi or Female Ninja, was the first time we saw a female protagonist, and it wasn't great, but hey, it marks an end to a great franchise that helped Sega become what they are today, third-party developers.
Man, fuck you, Fort. This shit is legendary.
This game is the cash cow for Sega since the beginning of time, well after Alex Kidd had his run on the Sega Master System. Because there are so many games that Sonic was featured in, much like Mario, we will be making an episode in the future that only covers Sonic, so be on the lookout for it. For the purpose of this video, we will only be talking about the console releases, starting with the original Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. Too long didn't read it, only the mainstream games. Sonic was mentioned earlier as the major mascot for Sega, but to be honest, there was always a battle for who could become the popular poster child for Sega. Sonic managed to be that mascot for quite some time and is still a popular name in gaming, albeit not in the forefront like he used to be. The first game was released in 1991 for the Mega Drive and Genesis and was promoted as having blast processing, but the truth is the game was super fucking slow in my opinion. The refresh rate for the game was the best selling point, but if you push Sonic, he wouldn't really run that fast. I don't care what anybody says, he is very slow in my opinion. The whole idea of the game was for Sonic to rescue his friends from Dr. Robotnik, who was after the Chaos Emeralds. The sequel, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, was the first game to feature a new playable character, Miles Tails Prower. It's also a lot faster than Sonic 1. You could control one character, or the other, or play as both. But if you weren't careful, this could make getting the Chaos Emerald stressful because the computer would lag behind. The good thing about this game was that it continued with the power and hype of the initial game and continued to push Sega forward in the 1990s console war with Nintendo. The next entry would be the ill-fated Sega CD entry, but don't be fooled. Many people consider Sonic CD to be one of the greatest Sonic games of all time, if not the best. In my opinion, it definitely is. It still to this day is the highest selling Sega CD game at 1.5 million units sold. Sonic 3 was one of the first entries that were a little bit different. The game was technically part of a 2-game series, the first part being Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which was a fully fledged game on its own, and the other half being Sonic and Knuckles. Oh yeah, Knuckles is a part of this game. He's awesome too, he can fly. He's got spikes on his hand and shit. Now this game was strange. It was a large black cart with a flip top on top that allowed for different games to be stacked on top. You were ideally supposed to put Sonic 3 on top and that would complete both parts of the game, but you could play Sonic and Knuckles by itself. If you put Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on top of the cart, you could play Sonic 2 as Knuckles. Talk about some mad retconning. The final entry on the Genesis would be Sonic 3D Blast, and it was a crude attempt at 3D before the era of gaming that supported it. The issue was that the isometric perspective was something that many individuals didn't approve of because of the entire history of Sonic. There was never an isometric perspective featured, save some of the bonus stages in Sonic 3, but even then that was over the shoulder, not isometric.
When it was time for the Saturn to come out, you would expect for a standalone amazing title to be released, right? Well, unfortunately, there was a planned Sonic game for the Saturn, but it was canned. So we wouldn't see another Sonic entry until 1998 with Sonic Adventure. Now, this game looked amazing in all regards. It is a three-dimensional platforming game with both action as well as role-playing elements. And instead of being limited to just 2 characters, you had 6 awesome protagonists who were hard set on defeating Dr. Robotnik. The game was kept secret for a while, and when it was released, the world shook. This game has sold 2.5 million copies alone and is one of the greatest video games of all time. It was just badass. With 10 years of amazing Sonic games under their belt, Sonic Team USA, a subsidiary of Sega, decided it was time to continue the magic of the franchise and honor so many years of hard work with the release of Sonic Adventure 2 showcasing the new Shadow the Hedgehog, a sort of anti-hero if you will. Well, you can be the judge. Much like the previous game, there was a GameCube port that looked slightly better, but whichever version you play is ultimately the same, except that GameCube port of Adventure 2 in particular expanded a little bit while sacrificing online play. The only major downfall was the plot. which in earlier Sonic games wasn't a big deal because you could be as obscure as you wanted, but this game had a convoluted plot. That didn't stop people from playing the game and selling $44 million worth of copies. Talk about a damn good game. Then, things started getting a little weird. Sonic Heroes allowed for 3 people to be on the screen simultaneously, with you controlling all 3. It's kind of a racing game per se, but not as bad as that game. Yeah, controlling Knuckles, Tails, and Sonic was kind of hectic and silly, but hey, you could change teams to better suit what you wanted. But many people felt that it was a step in the wrong direction for the game. The camera, the collision physics, and ultimately all the issues with the previous Sonic games that Sega had seemingly ignored. It was still a commercial success, selling 1.42 million units during its lifetime. Then, it happened. Sonic the Hedgehog in 2006. Colloquially known as Sonic 06. Oh dear, this one. So this features Sonic, Shadow, and Silver, who was a new character, each with their own story arcs on perhaps one of the most ridiculous plotlines in the history of the Sonic series and gaming in general. Everything that could have gone wrong with the game seemed to go wrong. There were bugs, brutal camera issues, crippling loading times, and the controls were slippery and unreliable, and the levels were designed in such a way that it was just bad. It's often considered the worst game in the series, and a severe black mark on this franchise as a whole. To be honest, the newer formatted games with the three-dimensional aspects never really had the same magic of the retro entries, but people still loved them because of the name. Sonic Team would release Sonic Unleashed in 2008, featuring Sonic as a werehog. Yep, didn't make that one up. It played like Adventures, but it was the same concept, and in a dynamic contemporary market, it was successful, but it was not a game changer by any means. In the times of retro, you could easily release the same game over and over and people loved it. Look at Pokemon, Mario, Zelda, Double Dragon, and more. And maybe this was the thought process that brought us Sonic the Hedgehog 4.
Sonic the Hedgehog 4 was a contemporary reimagining of the style of Sonic that we all knew and loved before the Genesis era. It was a fantastic game that was the simple formula that worked before. It was released episodically, with episode 1 being released by Dimps and Sonic Team in 2010, with a second episode being released in 2012. But for some reason, Sonic couldn't replicate the momentum he had in the retro games, probably due to different engines being used over time. That same year, Sonic Colors was released, and it's a platformer that takes place in outer space. This game was cool to me because it changed perspectives mid-level with side-scrolling portions and third-person portions as well. It was a well-timed and well-received game, and some consider it to be a positive, honest attempt at what Sonic Team was trying to do many years before. Hey, by the way, do you miss the old Sonic when life was simple and gas was like $1 a gallon? Well, we can't bring that back, but we can bring back the old Sonic with Sonic Generations. This game was cool. It basically was a reimagining of the original Sonic with enhanced graphics and the ability to play stages from a third-person perspective. It sold 1.85 million copies. The next entry would be Sonic A Lost World for the Wii U, and it was a generic 3D adventure that wasn't as bad as Sonic 06, but it played like adventure. Again, the idea was kind of old, I guess. Oh shit! Sonic Mania! This game's fucking awesome! It was the game to celebrate 25 years with Sonic, and it brought back all the old games remixed and with awesome tracks to boot. It was without a doubt a massive commercial hit in 2017, and if you want a great contemporary Sonic game, get this one. The last major game in the series for the console era of Sonic was Sonic Forces, which is an action-adventure game with several levels that play a lot like previous games, and it was released with a game-crashing bug, so yeah, Sonic. Again, we will cover all of the Sonic games when we do the Sonic episode, but the important thing to mention is that Sonic was one of the franchises that struggled to get across the 90s to 2000s line like many before, but in the end, the games are perfect time wasters, and we will always remember the power of the retro Genesis games.
This game is fucking cool and memorable. Basically, you play as a news reporter who has dance-off and shootouts with aliens and stuff. It is notoriously catchy, and you have to pay attention or else your ratings will drop. Imagine Dance Dance Revolution with a gun, except you can control the moves with the gun controller alone, as it had a D-pad on it. Just trust me, check it out. There was a sequel in 2002, but the Dreamcast version was only released in Japan, so if you want to play it, you have to have a PlayStation 2, PC, or you could find it on a PSN. Oh boy, this one was an amazing third-person shooter-ish, rail shooter-ish, adventure action-ish kind of game in the arcades. That was great. It was the OG arcade game in 1985, and it was catchy. It was released on tons of platforms and was a major contender for one of the greatest arcade games of all time. The next entry would be Space Harrier 3D on the Sega Master System, and it had 3D glasses. But beware, you can't use those glasses unless you are using a CRT television. If you try to use them on stream or on a flat screen, it won't work. The final entry is Space Harrier 2, which was a launch title alongside Altered Beast for the Sega Genesis, but it saw it released for all of the consoles that were appropriate for the time, specifically gaming computers such as MSX, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Amiga and Atari ST. There was also a spin-off called Planet Harriers released in 2000 for the arcades. It was highly well received, so if you can find it, play it.
Spike Out. This game is a beat 'em up. I've never personally played it, but it looks really good for 1998. There was a sequel called Slash Out, which was medieval themed, released in 2000, as well as a spin-off called Spiker's Battle a year later. The final entry was Spike Out Battle Street, released in 2005. Star Horse is a horse racing game that has various reimaginings in the arcade and boasted the ability to simulate probability of races based on stats from the Japanese Racing Association. Over 4.8 billion yens worth of revenue has been generated from these machines. I personally saw these in Japan. They're cool. Graphics are nice too.
We just talked about Streets of Rage in the previous episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show, where we talked about the fighting genre. You can find it in the video section of this channel, down by the past broadcasts under the playlist called Ready Go Gaming Show.
Super Monkey Ball is an adorable and addictive game that started in the arcades in 2001, but only in Japan. The real cash cow for this series was the home port on the GameCube. It had different modes to play on, but the kicker was it had these elements that were made popular by games such as Marble Madness and Labyrinth. You would move your monkey, which was inside of a ball, hence Monkey Ball, over platforms that were difficult to navigate. As a launch title, it helped push the GameCube into popularity. The next entry was Super Monkey Ball 2, and it was practically the same game in application and presentation with 100 levels split up over 10 worlds. And of course there were occasional cutscenes, extra stuff. The kicker is you had unlimited lives to navigate the puzzles, and it's the perfect time waster, literally. It's so much fun. Everyone was ready for the next game because it was a simple yet difficult game that also had its own charm. But then they made the next entry for the Game Boy Advance. This game was not made by Sega, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one, Super Monkey Ball Deluxe, which was a game with exceptionally improved graphics given the engine it was created on. It wasn't a new game per se, but it reimagined all the levels from Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2 and added tons of new modes to play. The PS2 version was somewhat lacking with its enhanced load times, emphasis on enhanced, so check out the Xbox version. Jumping back to the handheld spectrum, the next game was Super Monkey Ball Touch and Roll on the DS. It has the same elements as before, and you can use the touchpad to navigate your obstacles. Super Monkey Ball Adventure would be the first major departure for the series. Instead of featuring puzzles, we were given a platformer game. While it might look like a regular game in the first few levels, you soon realize that you're playing Sonic 06 style levels with Super Monkey Ball, which isn't a bad thing, it was just overly ambitious, and sales reflected that. A year later, in 2006, Super Monkey Ball Banana Blitz was released, allowing the user to use the Wiimote to control the environment, not the balls themselves as you did in earlier titles. The Wiimote aspect alone was a major reason why this game did not sell well. People were simply used to the older style. So why not use another peripheral like the Wii Motion Board? Oh man, Super Monkey Ball Step and Roll did just that. It used the Wiimote, and if you really wanted to add a fresh spritz of fun to your game, you could use the Wii Motion Plus balance board. It was bad. As was the next entry, Super Monkey Ball 3D, and the final entry, Banana Splits. To be honest, the series was amazing in the beginning, then it kind of died from existence, but hey, who knows, maybe we'll see another amazing game released following the traditional format.
Thunderblade. This game is an old-school arcade game that was on every single console after it was released in the arcades. Basically, it's a helicopter version of Afterburner, so you are a little bit closer to the ground as opposed to thousands of feet in the air. It also changes perspective occasionally. There was a follow-up by the name of Super Thunderblade that was made exclusively for Sega Genesis, and it handles the same way and had just as much of a positive response. Valkyria Chronicles is a relatively newer series that was created in 2008 for Sony platforms. It is a tactical RPG that uses a system known as Blitz, or Battle of Live Tactical Zones. It is a unique spin on the concept, and many of the people who developed it were the same individuals who made Sakura Wars. and the actual gameplay tactics were based on the once in popular films such as Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, and even Combat. The sequel unfortunately was released only on the PlayStation Portable, which is a shame given the power of the first entry on the PlayStation 3. But Valkyria Chronicles 2, despite being on a handheld platform, was still phenomenal. It kept the magic of the first game and even expanded on some of the capabilities afforded to the player in the first game. For example, individual units could be expanded upon with the use of a skill tree, and new classes were introduced. The third entry was again only released on PSP and only in Japan, which was unfortunate because it was a pseudo-popular franchise in America, but that didn't mean it sold well. To play this game, you will need a translation patch, and luckily for you, if you look hard enough, you can find it. The final entry came out early last year and introduced even more concepts that were not present in the previous games. And also, it was released worldwide for the Switch, Xbox One, PC, and PS4. There was one more spin-off called Valkyria Revolution, released before 4, and it takes place in an alternate universe and is instead of an action role-playing game. But if you want the true tactical RPG experience, I would stay away from this one.
Virtua Cop. This was one of the major light gun arcade franchises for Sega. In fact, I played all of them, and they're actually pretty fun. The first was kind of simple, but it set the standard for future gun games such as House of the Dead and Time Crisis. Oh, and if you're curious, it was known as Virtua Squad. The sequel was known as Virtua Cop 2, and it was awesome. I absolutely love how simplistic this game is, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing it as a kid. Personally, I enjoyed the PC version, but maybe that's because I could choose from 3 different characters. The final entry was exclusively in the arcades, and it was also just as fun using the Sega Cheer Hero system. It looked really advanced and played very well. It had a few chapters, but you'd have to play them in a very specific order to unlock different difficulties. If you want to know how, play it simple, normal, hard. Oh, and on normal you can't let the boss escape, then the hard mission you have to destroy all the missiles after the tank boss. Sounds kind of Donpachi-ish. Virtua Fighter. We're going to continue talking about some of the other Virtua games, as we already talked about this franchise in the last episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Again, it's under the past broadcast, so check it out. Virtual Striker is a soccer game in the arcades that started with Virtua Striker in 1994 and is claimed by many people to be the best arcade soccer game available. There was a follow-up with Virtua Striker 2 in 1997, but over time the entire series would just be a rebrand. 2 more releases were made, Virtua Striker 3 for the GameCube, and the most recent release was Virtua Striker 4 in 2006.
Well, one more Virtua game to talk about with. Oh, this is virtual. Well, that's different. Oh yeah, this is a fighting game. It's kind of cool, and if you like Gundam or mech combat, choose this game. It plays a lot like Cyberbots from Capcom, but this one was AM3 again kicking ass. The full name of the game was Virtual-On Cyber Troopers, which honestly sounds like a badass golf game at first, but it's a robot fighting game that ironically started in the arcade in America. It was released for the Saturn and PC though. The next entry was Cyber Troopers Virtual-On Oratorio Tangram. What a mouthful. This one started in arcades in Japan and then was released on Dreamcast in 1999 and Xbox 360 10 years after. The third entry was Cyber Troopers Virtual-On Force and was phenomenal. The graphical requirements for this game in the arcades was highly praised, and eventually given this success, it was released in home ports, but only for the Xbox 360, and only in Japan. The final entry was Virtual-On Mars, which was created in 2003, but iconically remade in 2013 to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the game. This time, it was an action-adventure game and was bad. Yakuza was Sega's cash cow for what many would consider a Grand Theft Auto clone such as Volition's Saints Row series, or State of Emergency, or Dead Rising. It was a pseudo-open-world action-adventure game that had a weird history. This series, like many with Japanese origins, was plagued with regional exclusive releases, much like Final Fantasy, which if you are unfamiliar with, can be kind of confusing, but we are going to try to explain it the best we can. Here we go. Yakuza, or Ryuga Gotoku, which means like a dragon, was released in 2005 in Japan and follows the exploits of Kazuma Kiryu, a member of the Yakuza. Much like Shenmue, this game was heavy on cinematics, but people loved it, finding it to become a Shenmue-style game that bridged the gap for Sega into the contemporary spectrum. In total, it sold 1 million units. It was released as Yakuza in 2006 in America. The sequel, Ryuga Gotoku 2, was released in 2006, so while America had Yakuza 1, Japan already had Yakuza 2. This game fixed a lot of the chief complaints that consumers had, mostly concerning the fighting mechanism, which was kind of clunky in the previous game, and was again highly praised. America received Yakuza 2 in 2008. Talk about a while, huh? Well, when America received Yakuza 2, another Yakuza game was released in Japan, called Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan, which was a period game, placed during the Edo period. It was drastically different than the previous entries, but it still had the same cinematic power that the previous entries had. It was never released in America.
The next entry would return to the stories of Kazuma with Yakuza 3 in 2009 in Japan and 2010 in America. It introduced tons of new concepts such as the option for first-person perspective. However, if you looked at the wrong person, they'd beat the fuck out of you. Also, there were new battle mechanics and new actions. To date, it has sold roughly 683,905 copies. The next entry was called Yakuza 4 Densetsu o Sugamono, or Successor of the Legend, and follows the traditional formula for a successful Yakuza game. Again, it received highly favorable reviews. The PSP game that paralleled it, which was a trope for the series, was Black Panther, Like a Dragon, A New Chapter. I'll never understand how Japanese title their games, and I'll never attempt to say a Japanese game again. But basically, it's a continuation of the series as a spin-off. It even had a television version of it. In 2011, Yakuza Dead Souls was released, and this time it was non-canon, but set around the time of the events in Yakuza 4. And it's a zombie survival horror game. Talk about a departure for the series. And as you could logically assume, people thought it was a joke. That same year, the previous PSP version received a sequel with Ryo ga Gotoku Ashura Hin, or Like a Dragon Ashura Chapter. Given the failure of the previous Yakuza entries, which I said was non-canon, Sega decided it was time to return to its roots with Yakuza 5, but before they released that, they re-released Yakuza 1 and 2 in an HD collection for the PS3 and Wii U. Later that year, they would release Yakuza 5, and boy, was it a beast. This game took so much of Japanese culture and perfectly interwove it into a beautiful masterpiece of a game in 2012, but the rest of the world wouldn't get a chance to see it until 2015. It's supposed to be released on PS4 sometimes this year, so keep an eye out for it.
After Yakuza 5, Sega decided to hop all the way back in standards to their feudal-era spin-off series with Yakuza Ishin, but it takes place almost 200 years after the events of the previous spin-off. It was also a fantastic game that as a spin-off was highly favored. But again, it was only released in Japan. Yakuza 0 would be the next major entry that would be released only in Japan in 2015. Yakuza was very much like Final Fantasy, where the Japanese entry would be released in Japan, with the other version coming out 3 to 4 years later. Yakuza 0 was released in Japan after Yakuza 5 had just been released to US markets. And if you are wondering, we only saw it on the PlayStation 4 in 2017, and PC players had to wait another year. Yakuza had already been a legacy series, so what do? Well, you do the old-fashioned remake, of course. That's what Sega did with Yakuza Kiwami, which through and through was a top-to-bottom remake of Yakuza 1. And they even did it a second time with Yakuza Kiwami 2 in 2017. Every year seemed to be a mashed-up convoluted release party for these games, so we will tell you the proper order. Here we go. Yakuza 1 should be your first game, or you could play Kiwami. Then you would play Yakuza 2 or Kiwami 2. From that point on, Yakuza 3, Yakuza 4, 5, 0, then 6. That's right, Yakuza 6, The Song of Life, was just released worldwide last year, so check it out, it looks awesome.
Zaxxon is one of the most popular retro Sega arcade games known to mankind. Almost every version of Zaxxon that was ported was notable and super fun to play. It was a simple isometric-based shooter that was a perfect time waster, and it was ported onto everything. I'm talking the Commodore 64, Intellivision, ColecoVision. Atari had versions on 3 separate consoles. It jumped to Europe for the Amiga, Dragon 32 and the ZX Spectrum. In Japan, it was on everything, such as the SG-1000 and the MSX, and it won tons of awards and still holds a candle against other arcade games. It spawned merchandise, board games, and tons of clones and unauthorized variances. 3 more games were created, but none held a candle to the original Zaxxon. Alright, that was a hell of an episode. That was probably one of the longest episodes that we've ever made. I think the only other one that came that close was the RPG genre video, which was a really fun one to make as well. For those of you who are curious, the next episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show is going to be about Acclaim. We're going to be learning from the beginning to the end and everything that's in between. We're going to have 2 awesome guest speakers on that, Barley and Tesseract. So I'm looking forward to it. I don't know if you are. I am. But thank you so much for sticking around so far in the season. We still have many episodes planned, and then we're going to kick off with season 2 some point probably at the end of this year. I'm super stoked for that. But I don't really have anything else to say. Thank you so much for spending the time to watch this awesome video on Sega. And from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.